What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
No call, no cake, no gift. Year after year. Not even a text. And then, on my brother's birthday, they handed him a brand new Jeep with a red bow on top. That's when I knew. I was done. But what happened after I cut them off? That got way crazier than I ever expected. I used to lie to myself about my family. I'd tell people we were just not very sentimental, or that we're not really into birthdays, even though deep down I knew it wasn't true. We were into birthdays, just not mine. Every year, when my birthday came around, I'd hope maybe this year would be different. I never expected anything huge. I wasn't asking for a big party or some expensive gift. Just a phone call would have been enough. A message. Even a stupid forwarded meme that said, "Happy birthday," with glitter text. Anything to show they remembered. But instead, the day would pass like any other, silent from their end, like I didn't even exist in the family group chat. Sometimes I'd send a message myself, just to check in. It always ended up being me reaching out. Me carrying the relationship. Me pretending I didn't notice the silence. But when it was my brother's turn, oh, they pulled out all the stops. Balloons, custom cakes, coordinated family dinners, long Facebook posts with baby photos, and "We're so proud of you" captions. He's 4 years younger than me, and somehow always the center of their attention. When we were younger, I told myself it was because he was the baby. When we got older, I convinced myself he probably just needed more support. But the truth hit me when I turned 30. I got a spam email from an old college mailing list. That was the only message in my inbox that day. My parents didn't even send a text. No one called. My brother posted a TikTok about his gym routine and didn't mention it once. That was the year I stopped pretending it didn't bother me. But I still didn't say anything. I told myself I was over it, that I had outgrown needing anything from them. I focused on my own life. I had just started building a small consulting business, and I was too busy anyway. Or so I told myself. But the resentment? It doesn't go away just because you stop looking at it. It piles up. Quietly. Invisibly. Until one day, something tiny tips the whole thing over. That day came on my brother's birthday. My mom had sent me a casual message a week before, asking if I could swing by for dinner. No mention of what the dinner was for. I said sure. I hadn't seen them in a while, and I figured maybe they wanted to reconnect. Maybe they felt bad. Maybe this was their way of saying sorry without saying it out loud. I showed up a little late because of a client call that ran long. When I walked in, I knew immediately I had been an idiot for hoping. The dining room was decked out. Streamers. Balloons. A banner that said, "Happy birthday, Josh," in huge letters. Everyone was there. Aunts. Uncles. Even people I didn't recognize. And in the driveway, parked right in front of the house, was a brand new Jeep. Glossy black. Giant red bow. Shiny chrome wheels. I actually thought it was someone else's car at first. But then I saw the little card stuck in the windshield that said, "To Josh, love Mom and Dad." I stood there, holding a store-bought bottle of wine I'd picked up as a generic gesture, completely stunned. No one greeted me. No one even seemed to notice I'd arrived. I walked inside, forced a smile, and made my way to the kitchen to drop off the wine. My mom gave me a quick hug and said, "Oh good, you made it. Josh is out back, he's going to freak when he sees the car." I waited for her to say something else. Anything. Maybe, "How have you been?" Or even, "Sorry we missed your birthday." But she turned and walked away like I was a guest at someone else's party. I didn't stay long. I said hi to a few people, made small talk with a cousin I hadn't seen in years, then quietly slipped out through the side door before they brought out the cake. No one followed me. No one asked why I left. I drove home with the radio off and my hands clenched on the wheel, not angry exactly, just done. Something in me went quiet. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just knew I had reached a limit I hadn't known existed. When I got home, I turned off my phone. I let the silence settle. Then I opened up my contacts and deleted the family group chat. Removed my mom. Removed my dad. Removed my brother. I unfollowed them on social media. Blocked them, actually. No warning. No final message. Nothing dramatic. Just gone. Like they had made me feel for years. like I didn't exist. And I thought that would be the end of it. I thought maybe they'd get the message and let it go. Maybe they'd finally understand how it felt to be ignored. But that's not what happened. Because cutting them off didn't make them quiet. It made them crazy. When I cut them off, I wasn't trying to make a scene or punish anyone. I didn't go on social media and post some dramatic explanation. I didn't send a long message telling them how hurt I was or what they did wrong. I didn't ask for an apology or attention or anything really. I just disappeared. And that, apparently, was the most unforgivable thing I could have done, because the silence didn't stay quiet for long. At first, it was subtle. A couple of missed calls from my mom, spaced out over a few days. No voicemails. No texts. Just that missed call notification blinking on my screen like a reminder that someone still wanted control of the narrative. I ignored them. Then the messages started. Hey, just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a bit. Josh is wondering if you're okay. Each one shorter, colder, more performative than the last. There was never a question of why I hadn't been around. Never a hint of ownership. Just this weird passive-aggressive concern that felt more like bait than care. I didn't answer. I had no interest in being dragged back into the cycle of pretending everything was fine. I had done that for years. Smiled through the dinners, showed up to the birthdays, laughed at the jokes, nodded through the guilt trips. I was done. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted peace. But of course, people like them don't let go of their control quietly. The turning point came at my cousin Lindsay's wedding. I hadn't planned to go, but she was one of the few relatives I genuinely liked, and I didn't want to punish her for things that weren't her fault. I figured I could go, keep it low-key, and leave before any drama unfolded. But the second I walked into the reception hall, I knew something was off. The looks. The whispers. The forced smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes. It felt like walking into a courtroom where I was already on trial. During dinner, one of my uncles leaned over and asked if I was feeling better. I had no idea what he meant. He gave me a kind of pitying look and said, "Your mom said you've been going through some stuff. We all hope you're getting the help you need." I just stared at him. Help? What help? What stuff was I supposed to be going through? That night, I learned my parents had been telling people I was having a mental health crisis. Not directly, of course. They were too passive-aggressive for that. But they had been worried, apparently. Said I'd become distant. Said I was struggling with things from the past, whatever that meant. My mother, in her usual tone of condescending martyrdom, had allegedly told one of my aunts that she didn't know what more she could do and that I was shutting out the people who loved her the most. They painted a picture of themselves as confused, heartbroken parents, blindsided by a daughter who had suddenly gone cold for no reason. It was almost impressive, the way they twisted the narrative without ever saying anything directly damaging. They made themselves the victims. They weaponized confusion. And the worst part? Some people believed them. Not because they were convincing, but because it was easier than questioning a family dynamic that had always been lopsided. I didn't defend myself. I didn't stand up and start shouting across the reception. I just nodded, smiled, and excused myself to the restroom. I sat in a stall for 10 minutes, staring at the tile floor, trying to decide if I should just leave. But then I realized something. They could only control the story if I stayed quiet. If I kept pretending their behavior was something I had to accept. That night, I started unfollowing more relatives. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. I wasn't going to keep connections with people who only saw me through my parents' lens. If someone reached out and asked directly, I told them the truth, that my relationship with my parents had been one-sided for years, and that I finally stopped pretending otherwise. Most people didn't reach out. The ones who did really did were the ones I chose to keep. A handful. That's it. I started seeing clearly how many relationships in my life were just strings tied to the same central knot. You cut one, and the whole tangle starts to unravel. The messages from my parents changed tone after that. Less concerned, more cutting. My dad sent one long message, unusual for him, about how family was about forgiveness and how I was setting fire to the foundation over something as petty as a birthday. He ended it by saying, "One day you'll regret this, and by then, we won't be here to fix it." That was the moment I knew they were never going to take responsibility. They were never going to say sorry. They were never going to admit that they'd treated me like an afterthought while pouring everything they had into my brother. But what really sealed it wasn't the wedding, or the messages, or the way people started tiptoeing around me. It was what my dad did next. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was strategic. Calculated. Like a move on a chessboard he thought I wasn't watching. He tried to take my business. Or at least, make it look like it was his. And that's when the silence stopped being a boundary and became a war. I had built that business from the ground up with no loans, no handouts, and certainly no help from anyone in my family, let alone my father, who, up until that point, had shown little to no interest in what I actually did for a living. When I first started, I was freelancing from a folding table in a one-bedroom apartment with barely enough money to cover both rent and groceries, and even then, he'd made sarcastic comments about how consulting sounded like something people made up when they didn't want a real job. So imagine my confusion when, one afternoon, I received a piece of mail that didn't make sense, an envelope addressed to me but from a state agency. I opened it absent-mindedly between client calls, expecting it to be a renewal notice or tax form, but it wasn't. It was a notice of a business name registration request filed under my exact business name, by my father. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe someone else with the same name? Maybe a clerical error? But no, the form included his name, his contact details, and, unbelievably, a handwritten signature that matched his looping, self-important scrawl. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to process it. It felt surreal. I didn't understand what his angle was, because nothing about it made sense from a place of logic. If he wanted to sabotage me, there were easier ways. If he wanted to partner with me, he could have asked. But this was an attempt to quietly file paperwork that would let him claim ownership of something I had built entirely on my own. I didn't call him. I didn't text. I drove straight to the address listed as his point of contact and knocked on their front door. My mother answered, clearly surprised to see me standing there unannounced after months of silence. She opened her mouth like she wanted to start with some pleasantry, but I didn't give her a chance. I asked where Dad was. Her face fell. She pointed to the garage. He was out there, sitting in a lawn chair next to the Jeep they'd given Josh, sipping from a travel mug and scrolling on his phone like nothing in the world could touch him. When he saw me, he raised his eyebrows slightly, like I was a stranger who had shown up on his property by mistake. I didn't sit down. I didn't soften my tone. I held up the letter and said, "What the hell is this?" He didn't flinch. Didn't pretend he didn't know what I was talking about. He just shrugged and said, "It's just a precaution. You never registered the name officially." I figured I'd help out and do it before someone else stole it. It was one of those moments where someone lies to your face with so much practiced calm that it almost makes you question your own perception of reality. I had registered the domain. I had registered the LLC in a different name, yes, but the brand name, the one I used publicly, I hadn't filed as a trademark yet because I didn't think anyone would care enough to take it. Apparently, I was wrong. I asked him what exactly he intended to do with the registration. He leaned back, smiled, and said, "Well, technically, once it goes through, I could license it back to you. Keep things in the family. Help with branding. Maybe get some of those marketing decisions back under control." That was when it hit me. He didn't think of me as an independent adult running her own company. He still saw me as a rebellious kid playing pretend with a laptop. And worse, he thought he was entitled to anything I created, simply because we shared a last name. It wasn't about the business, it was about ownership. Control. Optics. To him, I was still a piece on his chessboard, even if I had stopped playing his game. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't even call him the names I wanted to. I walked back to my car, sat in the driver's seat for a solid 5 minutes, then opened my phone and contacted the lawyer I had worked with when drafting my first service contracts. I explained what had happened and asked, bluntly, what legal options I had. The next morning, we filed a cease and desist letter demanding he withdraw the registration request and threatening legal action if he failed to comply. A week later, the backlash started. Not from him, he went suspiciously quiet, but from Josh, who suddenly found the time to text me. He accused me of trying to destroy the family, said I was too sensitive, and that I should have just talked to Dad instead of making it a legal thing. He said it was embarrassing, that I was acting like some corporate villain. That was rich, coming from someone who had never worked a day in his life outside of his part-time gym job and still lived in the house they grew up in. But this wasn't about embarrassment. This was about boundaries, something they had never respected, not once, not ever. I didn't owe them silence, and I certainly didn't owe them control over my livelihood. I let the lawyer handle the formal part. Privately, I made a list of every account, email, document, and business platform where my brand name appeared, and I updated every single one. I filed the trademark. I hired a second lawyer to draft a formal statement of business independence. I wasn't just protecting my brand. I was cutting the last thread they thought they still had. They had taken my absence personally. Now they would have to live with the consequences of trying to drag me back in through legal paperwork. And still, I thought that would be enough. I thought a legal boundary would make them back off for good. But they weren't done. Not even close. Because the moment I started protecting what was mine, they realized they had one weapon left. Their reputation. And they were about to throw it all into the fire. When the cease and desist letter landed on their doorstep, I expected a phone call, maybe a half-hearted attempt at reconciliation, or even some passive-aggressive message from my mother pretending not to understand what was happening. What I didn't expect was a complete and deafening silence. For days, there was nothing. No calls, no texts, no vague posts on social media. It was as if they had collectively vanished, and part of me, the part that still wanted to believe in basic decency, thought maybe they were stunned into reflection. Maybe they'd finally realized they'd crossed a line they couldn't wiggle their way back from. But then, just when I began to let myself believe the storm had passed, the next wave hit, this time online, and with a cruelty that felt both deliberate and rehearsed. It started with a post from my father's Facebook account, one of those vague, sanctimonious paragraphs dressed up like wisdom, but aimed like a dagger. He wrote about raising children who grow up to forget the sacrifices made for them, about entitlement dressed up as independence, and about the heartbreak of watching your own blood turn their back on family. No names were mentioned, of course, but the timing, the tone, the sudden influx of likes and supportive comments from their friends made the target unmistakably clear. Then came the private messages. Some from old family acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years, others from people I barely remembered from childhood church events or high school functions. Most of them offered some version of unsolicited advice, packaged in guilt and wrapped in condescension. I hope you'll find it in your heart to forgive. Family is everything, no matter the misunderstandings. You only get one set of parents. And the most infuriating one, you seem like you're going through something. If you need to talk, I'm here. As if my response to calculated sabotage and emotional abandonment could be reduced to a personal meltdown. I stayed quiet publicly. I didn't post rebuttals, didn't share screenshots or long explanations. I focused on my work, continued building what I had started, and poured my energy into the parts of my life that actually brought me peace. But I did document everything, every message, every post, every indirect smear, and passed it along to my attorney. Not because I wanted to escalate, but because I needed a record. Because the moment you start protecting yourself from toxic people, they will go out of their way to look like victims, and I wasn't going to let them rewrite the story to suit their version of events. A few days later, I received confirmation that the trademark I had filed was approved. It was a small but significant victory, one that drew a hard legal line around something they had tried to take. And when the paperwork arrived, officially naming me the sole owner of the brand, I remember placing it on my desk and staring at it for a long moment, not because I doubted what I had done, but because I had finally taken something back that I didn't even realize had been slipping from my hands for years, authority over my own life. Of course, they didn't let that go quietly either. My brother, who had remained mostly silent through the legal side of things, suddenly popped up with a series of Instagram stories. He filmed himself walking around their house, making cryptic comments about people who forget where they come from and who act like they're self-made but forget who paid for their textbooks. It was all nonsense. None of them had ever paid a cent toward my education, and I had the debt statements to prove it. But they weren't trying to be factual. They were trying to be loud. And in a small town, volume often wins over truth. So I did the one thing they weren't prepared for. I spoke, once, clearly, and without venom. I drafted a single statement. No drama. No insults. Just facts. I posted it to my professional page, the only platform I still used under my real name. It read, "For anyone who has seen recent public comments questioning my relationship with my family, I want to clarify a few things. I was emotionally neglected for years while my sibling was consistently celebrated. My birthday was ignored. My milestones were dismissed. My work was disrespected. When I built a business from nothing, my father tried to file for control of the name behind my back. Legal action was taken to protect what I created. Since then, I've been the subject of misleading public narratives and personal attacks. I will not be speaking further on this, but I stand by my decisions. Boundaries are not betrayal." That post did more than I expected. It didn't go viral, but it did travel. A few people reached out privately to apologize for judging too quickly. A couple of extended relatives quietly unfollowed my parents. A distant aunt messaged me a simple, "I believe you," and nothing more. But most importantly, the online noise stopped. For the first time in weeks, I could open my phone without seeing another passive-aggressive dig or unsolicited opinion. And for a moment, it felt like I had finally won. I had spoken truth. I had drawn a line. I had protected what was mine. But it wasn't the end. Not yet. Because while I had shut down the public attacks, the personal cost of what they'd done, the entitlement, the sabotage, the complete erasure of who I was in favor of who they wanted me to be, still lived in the background. And there was one final move I had to make. Something that wasn't about legality or public image. Something that would make sure they'd never be able to pretend I was still part of their picture again. In the months that followed my final public statement, the silence that I had once craved became something entirely different, heavier, not because I missed them, but because I hadn't yet made the final cut. I had drawn the line, yes, and I had spoken my truth, and they had, for the most part, backed off. But there was still a thread, a quiet, invisible one, that hadn't been severed. It was the thread of what they still believed they were entitled to. The illusion that no matter how far I pulled away, no matter how clearly I shut the door, I was still, in some fundamental way, theirs. Their daughter. Their responsibility. Their disappointment. And until I burned that last bridge with deliberate finality, they would keep believing there was a chance to spin the story back in their favor. The opportunity presented itself almost too neatly, like it had been waiting in the wings. I received a call, not from my family, of course, but from a friend who still lived in the neighborhood. She had been at a community fundraiser, one of those casual weekend things with raffles and booths and too many awkward small-talk conversations. Apparently, my parents had been there too, holding court as they often did, smiling wide and pretending nothing in their lives was broken. During one of those conversations, my father mentioned that he and my mother were worried about the future, especially now that the family dynamic has changed, and that they were exploring options for ensuring the family legacy stays intact. He had said it with enough ambiguity to sound noble, but my friend heard what I immediately understood without translation. They were looking for ways to legally entangle themselves again, to sneak back into my life through financial or estate channels. Probably under the guise of protecting what's ours. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. This was exactly the kind of move they would try. After the failed business name registration, and after the public sympathy campaign had fizzled out, they would pivot toward a longer play, inheritance, estate planning, or some other manipulative strategy meant to tether me back to them in ways that looked generous on paper but would cost me dearly in control, time, and peace. I didn't want a dramatic confrontation. I didn't want another volley of back-and-forth messages or some drawn-out fight about who owed what to whom. I wanted a clean cut, the kind that left no questions, no misunderstandings, no way back. And so I crafted my final message, not an email, not a text, but something physical, tangible, something they couldn't pretend they hadn't seen or misread. I printed it, folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and I sent it to them on a day that had once been about celebration, but had, over the years, turned into a yearly performance of imbalance and cruelty, my brother's birthday. Inside the envelope was a single legal document, an updated version of my will and estate directive. It stated, in unambiguous terms, that my parents and my brother were to receive nothing from my estate under any circumstances. No rights. No assets. No say. It included a clause explicitly barring them from acting as executors, advisors, or legal contacts in the event of any emergency. I had named 2 close friends, people who had actually shown up when it mattered, as the sole trustees of my future. Attached to that document was a single-page list, nothing more than a table with 2 columns. One listed every birthday I had since I turned 18. The other, beside each date, recorded what I received from them that year. Most lines were blank. A few had the word ignored. One said, called the day after. One had a dash where nothing would have been redundant. There was no letter. No emotional summary. No, I hope this explains things. Just those documents. A record of silence returned in kind. A mirror held up with ruthless clarity. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't get one. But 2 days later, I saw that my mother had deleted every photo of me from her social media accounts. My father locked his profile. My brother posted a cryptic message about knowing who's real, and then nothing else. It was the closest thing I was ever going to get to an acknowledgement, and, honestly, it was enough. Because I wasn't looking for remorse. I was looking for release. And that's what I got. I don't talk about them anymore. Not with friends, not in therapy, not even in passing when people ask about my childhood. I don't need to explain. I don't need to defend my decision. I don't need to carry the weight of someone else's shame. Cutting ties wasn't a moment, it was a process. One boundary at a time, one painful realization after another, one quiet decision layered on top of years of ignored signals and gaslit memories. They gave my brother a Jeep. They posted about him with hashtags like proud parents and our rock. They called him their future, their investment, their boy. They celebrated his wins like they were their own. And for me, there was always an excuse, a reason, a deflection. I was too independent, too dramatic, too sensitive, too much. So I gave them what they always claimed to want. Distance, freedom, silence. But I also gave them something they never expected, something final, something undeniable, something legal and binding. A gift in their language. But instead of keys and bows, I gave them a piece of paper that said, clearly and permanently, you don't own me. You never did. And now you never will. And honestly, that felt better than any cake.